Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and suddenly realized that the person you loved, the person you trusted with your whole heart, was actually your greatest threat? That moment when everything clicks into place and you understand that you're not safe, you've never been safe, and worse, that everyone you love is in danger because of your choices? I'm asking you this because I lived through it, and I need to share my story with you today, not just to heal myself, but because someone watching this right now might be living through the same nightmare I survived. And if my words can help even one person recognize the danger they're in and find the courage to escape, then every painful memory I'm about to relive will be worth it. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how the man who promised to love me forever became obsessed with destroying me publicly when I finally found the strength to leave, and how I fought back not just to save myself, but to protect my family from his calculated, terrifying revenge. I want you to understand something from the very beginning. This isn't just a story about a bad relationship or a difficult breakup. This is about surviving someone who saw me as property, who couldn't accept that I had the right to walk away, and who was willing to do absolutely anything to punish me for daring to choose myself over him. When I finally escaped, when I finally gathered every ounce of courage I had left and walked out that door, I thought the hardest part was over. But I was so incredibly wrong, because that's when his real plan began. That's when he decided that if he couldn't have me, he would make sure I had nothing left. No reputation, no peace, no safety, and he almost succeeded. But I'm here today, I survived, my family survived, and I'm going to tell you exactly how I did it, because the truth is that monsters don't always look like monsters. They look like the person who brings you flowers and tells you you're beautiful. They look like someone who seems charming to everyone else, while they're systematically dismantling your sense of self behind closed doors, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're so tangled up in their web that you can't see a way out. I met Marcus at a time in my life when I was vulnerable, though I didn't recognize it then. I had just moved to a new city for a job opportunity, leaving behind my tight-knit family and the support system I'd relied on my entire life. I was 27, excited about my career, eager to prove myself in a competitive industry, and admittedly lonely in a place where I knew absolutely no one. He appeared in my life like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I'd been saying. It was at a networking event, one of those awkward professional gatherings where everyone's trying too hard to make connections and impress each other. I was standing alone by the refreshment table, feeling out of place and wondering why I'd even bothered to come when he walked up with this disarming smile and said something that made me laugh, genuinely laugh, for the first time in weeks. Marcus was handsome in that classic way, tall with dark hair, well-dressed, articulate, the kind of man who commanded attention when he entered a room. But what struck me most wasn't his appearance. It was how he made me feel seen. In a room full of people performing their professional personas, he seemed genuinely interested in me as a person, not just as a potential business connection. We talked for hours that night, long after the event had officially ended, and the venue staff were giving us pointed looks. He asked about my dreams, my family, what had brought me to the city, and he listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. Looking back now, I can see that this was the first stage of his strategy. But at the time, it felt like fate, like I'd finally met someone who understood me on a level I'd never experienced before. Our relationship moved quickly, maybe too quickly, but I was caught up in the intoxicating feeling of being so completely desired and cherished. Within 3 weeks, we were spending every evening together. Within 2 months, he'd given me a key to his apartment. Within 4 months, he was suggesting I move in with him to save money on rent, framing it as a practical decision that would help me save for my future while also allowing us to build our life together. My parents were concerned about the speed of things when I told them. My mom, especially. She had this worried tone in her voice during our phone calls and kept asking if I was sure, if I really knew him well enough, if maybe I should slow down and give it more time. But I was defensive. I thought they were being overprotective and old-fashioned. I thought they couldn't understand what Marcus and I had because they weren't here to see it. I wish more than anything that I had listened to that worried tone in my mother's voice, that I had recognized it as the instinct of someone who loved me trying to warn me of danger. But I was so caught up in the romance of it all, in feeling chosen and special, that I dismissed their concerns and assured them everything was perfect. And for a while, it really did seem perfect. Marcus was attentive in ways I'd never experienced. He'd text me throughout the day just to say he was thinking about me. He'd surprise me with my favorite coffee in the morning. He'd plan elaborate dates that showed he paid attention to things I'd mentioned in passing. He seemed to anticipate my needs before I even voiced them, which felt like the deepest form of love and understanding. I didn't recognize it then as the hypervigilance of someone who was studying me, learning my patterns and preferences not out of love, but out of a need to control every aspect of who I was and who I would become. The changes started so gradually that I didn't notice them at first. Or maybe I noticed but made excuses. Told myself I was being paranoid or oversensitive. It began with small comments about my friends from back home. Nothing overtly negative, just observations that seemed caring on the surface. He'd say things like, "I noticed Sarah from college hasn't really asked how you're doing lately. She only talks about herself when you call her." Or, "It seems like your work friends only reach out when they need something from you. Have you noticed that?" At first, I'd defend my friendships, but he had a way of planting seeds of doubt that would grow in my mind over the following days and weeks. I started analyzing my relationships through this lens he'd created, looking for evidence of the selfishness or neglect he'd pointed out. And of course, when you're looking for problems, you find them. Nobody's perfect. Every friendship has moments of imbalance, but I began interpreting normal human imperfection as proof that Marcus was right, that these people didn't really care about me the way he did, that I was lucky to have someone who truly saw my worth. Gradually, I started pulling away from friends, making excuses when they'd reach out, declining invitations to visit home because Marcus and I had plans, or because the timing wasn't right, or because I was too busy with work. The isolation happened so slowly that I didn't see the walls being built around me until I was completely enclosed. My world shrank until it revolved almost entirely around Marcus, and he made sure I felt like that was exactly where I belonged. Like our intense, exclusive focus on each other was proof of how deep our love was rather than a warning sign of how dangerous our dynamic had become. Work became another battleground, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I loved my job, I was good at it, and I was starting to get recognition for my contributions. I'd come home excited to share news about a successful project or a compliment from my boss, expecting Marcus to celebrate with me, but his reactions were always slightly off. He'd congratulate me, but then immediately pivot to concerns, saying things like, "That's great, but I hope they're not going to start expecting you to work late all the time." Or, "Your boss seems to rely on you a lot. I hope you're not being taken advantage of." When I got a promotion that came with more responsibilities and occasionally longer hours, Marcus's mask started to slip more noticeably. He became sullen and withdrawn on evenings when I had to stay late. He'd make passive-aggressive comments about how my job was more important to me than our relationship. He'd give me the silent treatment and then deny anything was wrong when I'd ask. The emotional whiplash was exhausting. One moment he'd be loving and supportive, the next he'd be cold and distant, and I never knew which version of him I'd encounter. I found myself constantly trying to manage his moods, walking on eggshells, making myself smaller and smaller to avoid triggering his displeasure. I started turning down projects at work, being less visible, deliberately underperforming because the stress of dealing with Marcus's reaction to my success was worse than the disappointment of not advancing my career. I was sacrificing my professional dreams to keep peace in a relationship that was systematically destroying me, and the worst part is that I thought I was making these choices freely. I thought I was being mature and prioritizing my relationship. I didn't understand that I was being manipulated into giving up pieces of myself until there would be nothing left but what he wanted me to be. The first time Marcus showed me physical aggression, it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't a hit or a push. It was something more subtle but equally terrifying. We were arguing about me wanting to visit my parents for Thanksgiving. He wanted us to stay in the city and have a quiet holiday, just the two of us. And I was insisting that I needed to see my family because I hadn't been home in almost a year. The argument escalated, his voice getting louder, his face getting closer to mine, and then suddenly he punched the wall right next to my head, so close that I felt the rush of air from his fist. The sound of impact was deafening, and when he pulled his hand back, there was a hole in the drywall, and his knuckles were bleeding. He immediately crumpled, tears streaming down his face, apologizing profusely, saying he'd never felt so out of control, that he was terrified of losing me, that the thought of me being away from him even for a few days made him feel like he was dying inside. He begged me to forgive him, promised it would never happen again, said he'd get help, that he'd start therapy, that he'd do whatever it took to be the man I deserved. And I believed him. God help me. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was admitting that the man I loved, the man I'd built my life around, was dangerous. I convinced myself that it was an isolated incident, that he really was sorry, that everyone deserves a second chance. I went to Thanksgiving dinner with my family and lied through my teeth when they asked how things were, put on a performance worthy of an Oscar, smiled and laughed and told them how wonderful everything was while hiding the bruise on my arm where he'd grabbed me too tightly when I was leaving, squeezing hard enough to leave finger marks that lasted for more than a week. After that incident, there was a honeymoon period where Marcus was on his best behavior. He was sweet and attentive again, bringing me flowers and planning special dates, treating me like I was precious and fragile. But underneath that surface, I could feel something had fundamentally changed. There was a new level of tension in the air, an unspoken threat that colored every interaction. I became hyper-aware of his moods, constantly monitoring and adjusting my behavior to avoid triggering his anger. I stopped expressing opinions that might contradict his, stopped making plans without consulting him first, stopped even thinking of myself as an independent person with my own needs and desires. I existed in survival mode, though I couldn't have articulated it that way at the time. I just knew that keeping him happy had become the most important thing in my world, not because I loved him anymore, but because I was afraid of him, and that fear had wrapped itself around my heart so tightly that I couldn't remember what it felt like to breathe freely. The physical incidents became more frequent after that first time. It was like a dam had broken and he no longer felt the need to completely control himself. A shove here, a grab there, objects thrown near me if not directly at me, each incident followed by tearful apologies and promises to change that became increasingly hollow. I started documenting the incidents in a secret note on my phone, writing down dates and what happened, some part of me understanding that I was gathering evidence even though I couldn't admit to myself what I was gathering evidence for. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March, one of those deceptively normal days that start out ordinary and end up changing the entire trajectory of your life. I had come home from work in a good mood. My boss had just told me I was being considered for a major project that would be a huge career opportunity, and despite knowing Marcus wouldn't react well, I was too excited to hide it. I walked in with takeout from our favorite restaurant, thinking maybe the good food would soften the blow of my news, and I found him already in a dark mood, sitting in the living room in the dim light, not watching TV or looking at his phone, just sitting there in a way that made my stomach drop with dread. He asked where I'd been, why I was late, his voice flat and dangerous. I explained that I'd stopped for food, showed him the bag, tried to lighten the mood by saying I'd gotten his favorite. He stood up and knocked the bag out of my hands, food scattering across the floor, and started interrogating me about whether I'd been with someone else, whether I was cheating on him, whether I thought he was stupid enough to believe my lies. Nothing I said made any difference. He was in a rage that had nothing to do with reality and everything to do with his need to dominate and control. He backed me into a corner, literally, his hands on either side of my head against the wall, his face inches from mine, screaming about how I was ungrateful, how I was nothing without him, how he'd made me who I was and he could destroy me just as easily. In that moment, trapped and terrified, something inside me snapped, but not in the way he expected. Instead of crumbling, instead of apologizing and trying to de-escalate like I'd done dozens of times before, I felt this cold clarity wash over me. I looked into his eyes and I didn't see the man I'd fallen in love with. I didn't see someone who cared about me or who was struggling with his own demons. I saw someone who enjoyed my fear, who got satisfaction from my helplessness, who would never stop because my suffering was the point. In that crystalline moment of understanding, I knew with absolute certainty that if I stayed, one of two things would happen. Either he would eventually kill me in one of these rages, or I would stop being a person altogether, becoming just an empty shell that existed solely to absorb his anger and validate his need for control. Neither of those options was acceptable. Neither of those futures was one I could live with. So even though I was terrified, even though I had no idea how I was going to do it, I made a decision right there with my back against that wall. And his breath hot on my face, I decided that I was going to leave, that I was going to survive this, that I was going to get my life back, no matter what it took. I didn't tell him this, of course. I knew enough by then to understand that announcing my intention to leave would be the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. Instead, I let my body go limp, let tears flow, apologized for upsetting him, played the role he needed me to play. He eventually stepped back, his rage having run its course, and started his familiar cycle of apologies and promises. I nodded and accepted his words while my mind raced, already planning, already thinking about how I was going to escape this nightmare without him knowing until it was too late for him to stop me. The next 3 weeks were the longest and most terrifying of my entire life because I had to pretend everything was normal while secretly planning my escape. I had to be the compliant girlfriend he expected while simultaneously gathering resources and building a safety net he knew nothing about. The first thing I did was reach out to a domestic violence hotline. I called during my lunch break from work, sitting in my car in the parking garage with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The counselor I spoke with was incredibly kind and patient. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing was abuse, that it wasn't my fault, that I deserved help and safety. She walked me through the process of creating a safety plan, helped me think through details I never would have considered on my own. I opened a new bank account at a different bank, one that Marcus had no connection to, and started diverting small amounts of money there whenever I could do it without him noticing. I had to be so careful because he monitored our finances obsessively, questioning every transaction, but I found ways to get cash back at grocery stores, to claim expenses were higher than they actually were, slowly building up enough money to survive on for a few weeks after I left. I gathered my important documents, my birth certificate, passport, social security card, anything I couldn't easily replace, and I gave them to a coworker I trusted, someone Marcus had never met and didn't know existed. I told her just enough of the truth that she understood why I needed her help, without overwhelming her with details that might make her feel obligated to intervene before I was ready. I reached back out to friends I'd been neglecting for months, trying to rebuild burned bridges without being obvious about it. I had to be strategic and subtle because Marcus checked my phone regularly, so I used work email and created a new social media account he didn't know about to reconnect with people. Most of my friends were incredibly understanding when I reached out. They'd been worried about me. They'd noticed my withdrawal, and they were relieved to hear from me even though I couldn't tell them the whole truth yet. I asked my best friend from college, Jessica, if I could stay with her for a while, telling her vaguely that Marcus and I were having problems and I needed some space. She agreed immediately, no questions asked, and just knowing I had somewhere safe to go made the fear slightly more manageable. I started moving items out of the apartment little by little. Things Marcus wouldn't notice were missing. A few pieces of clothing here, some jewelry there, photos of my family, small items that had sentimental value. Every time I successfully smuggled something out, hidden in my work bag or in my car, I felt this small victory, this tiny reclamation of my autonomy. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases and explained my situation, asking what legal protections were available to me and what steps I should take to document the abuse. She advised me to keep detailed records of every incident, to take photos of any injuries, to save threatening text messages, all of which I was already doing, but her validation that these steps were important reinforced my determination. The hardest part of those 3 weeks was the constant acting, maintaining the facade that everything was fine, while my entire body was screaming with tension and fear. I had to continue being affectionate with him, had to respond to his touch without flinching even though my skin crawled, had to smile and laugh at his jokes and pretend I wasn't counting down the hours until I could escape. Every night I lay awake next to him, listening to him breathe, terrified he would somehow sense what I was planning, that he would check my phone or my email or my bank account and discover what I'd been doing. I had nightmares about him finding out before I could leave, about him hurting me or worse, about him going after my family to punish me. But I also had this growing sense of strength, this recognition that I was capable of more than I'd believed possible. The woman who was planning this escape was someone I barely recognized. She was brave and strategic and determined, so different from the shrinking, apologetic person I'd become over the past 2 years. I started to feel like I was reclaiming myself piece by piece, that even though I was still trapped in this nightmare, I was no longer powerless. I was taking action. I was fighting back in the only way available to me. Have you ever had to pretend everything is fine when your whole world is falling apart? Have you ever had to smile at someone who terrifies you just to keep yourself safe? I hope you never have to. But if you are going through something similar right now, please know that you're not alone, that there are people who understand, that there is a way out even when it feels impossible. The day I finally left will be burned into my memory forever, every detail crystal clear, every moment stretched out like time itself was moving differently. I had chosen a Friday because Marcus had a standing meeting every Friday afternoon that usually ran long, giving me a window of several hours to get out of the apartment and to safety. I'd taken the day off work, telling my boss I had a doctor's appointment, and I'd arranged for Jessica to come help me with her boyfriend's truck. We had planned to be in and out in under an hour, taking only what I absolutely needed and leaving everything else behind. Material possessions could be replaced. My life couldn't. That morning, I woke up next to Marcus feeling surreal, knowing it was the last time that within hours I would be free of him. I made him breakfast like I always did, kissed him goodbye when he left for work like I always did, told him I loved him like I always did, and the moment the door closed behind him, I started shaking so violently I had to sit down on the floor. I called Jessica to confirm she was on her way, then I started packing with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. I threw clothes into garbage bags, grabbed my laptop and chargers, took photos off the walls, worked with frantic efficiency born of pure fear and adrenaline. Jessica arrived with her boyfriend Tom, and they both hugged me tightly before we got to work. They didn't ask questions, they just helped me carry things down to the truck, making multiple trips, watching the clock, knowing that every minute brought us closer to Marcus potentially coming home early. We were almost done. The truck was loaded with my things, and I was doing one final sweep of the apartment to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything critical when I heard a key in the lock. My blood turned to ice, time stopped, and I watched in horror as the door opened and Marcus walked in, 3 hours earlier than he should have been. His face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, understanding, and then rage. Pure, molten rage that transformed his features into something monstrous. Jessica and Tom were still down at the truck. I was alone in the apartment with him, and I knew immediately that this was the most dangerous moment of my life. He moved toward me, and I ran for the door, but he was faster, grabbing my arm and yanking me back with such force that I felt something in my shoulder pull. He started screaming at me, calling me every vile name imaginable, demanding to know what I thought I was doing, telling me I wasn't going anywhere, that I belonged to him, that he would kill me before he'd let me leave. I was screaming for help, trying to pull away from him, and thank God, Jessica heard me and came running back up with Tom right behind her. Marcus let go of me when they burst through the door, and in that moment of hesitation, I ran past him, down the stairs, my shoulders screaming in pain but adrenaline carrying me forward. I jumped into the truck and we peeled out of the parking lot with Marcus running after us, still screaming, his voice following us down the street until we turned the corner and he disappeared from view. I broke down completely in the truck, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe, my entire body shaking with shock and relief and terror. Jessica held me while Tom drove, murmuring reassurances that I was safe now, that he couldn't hurt me anymore. But I knew that wasn't true. I knew this was just the beginning. We went straight to the police station where I filed a report and got a restraining order, showing them the photos I'd taken of bruises, the documentation of incidents I'd been keeping, the threatening text messages he'd sent in the past. The officer who took my report was professional, but I could see the pity in his eyes, and I hated that pity. Hated being someone who inspired that reaction. But I was also grateful that he took me seriously, that he didn't question whether I was overreacting or suggest I try to work things out with Marcus. The restraining order was granted immediately given the evidence I provided and the incident that had just occurred, and I was told that Marcus would be served with the papers within 24 hours. I stayed with Jessica that weekend, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound, convinced that somehow Marcus would find me and make good on his threats. Jessica's boyfriend installed extra locks on her doors and windows, and they both insisted I wasn't an inconvenience, that I could stay as long as I needed. On Sunday, Marcus started blowing up my phone with calls and texts that ranged from apologetic to threatening, begging me to come back one moment and promising to destroy me the next. I documented everything and forwarded it to my lawyer and the police, creating a digital paper trail of his harassment. But I had no idea what was really coming. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought getting away from him was the main battle. But Marcus had other plans. Plans that were calculated and cruel and designed to hurt me in ways I never imagined. On Monday morning, I woke up to dozens of notifications on my phone, messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, former colleagues, acquaintances, even my boss. My stomach dropped as I started reading them, because Marcus had spent his entire weekend creating a campaign to destroy my reputation and credibility. He had written long, detailed posts on social media, painting himself as the victim of an abusive, mentally unstable woman, claiming that I had been violent toward him throughout our relationship, that I had cheated on him repeatedly, that I had stolen money from him, that I was addicted to drugs and alcohol, that I had filed a false police report to cover up my own abusive behavior. He posted photos of the hole he'd punched in the wall, claiming I'd done it during one of my violent rages. He posted screenshots of text messages, but they were edited, manipulated to make innocuous conversations look incriminating. He tagged me in these posts, tagged my employer, tagged my family members, tagged anyone he could think of who knew me, ensuring that his lies would spread as far and wide as possible. He sent emails to my boss and HR department at my company, claiming I was unstable and potentially dangerous, suggesting they should be concerned about having me in the workplace. He contacted my professional network, people I'd worked with at previous jobs, people I'd collaborated with on projects, spreading his poison everywhere. The devastation was immediate and overwhelming. People I thought knew me, people I thought would question such extreme claims, seemed all too ready to believe them because Marcus was convincing and his lies were detailed, and he presented himself as a sympathetic victim. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from people wanting to know what was going on, some supportive, many judgmental, all of them requiring me to relive my trauma by explaining what had actually happened. My boss called me into her office, and I had to sit there, humiliated and crying, explaining that I was the victim of domestic violence and that my ex was retaliating against me for leaving. She was understanding, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, the uncertainty about whether she was getting the full story, and I felt my hard-earned professional reputation crumbling around me. My parents were devastated. They had received messages from Marcus filled with lies about me, and even though they didn't believe him, they were horrified that he was publicly attacking their daughter and felt helpless to protect me. My mom cried on the phone, apologizing for not insisting I leave him sooner, blaming herself for not seeing the signs, and I had to comfort her while I was falling apart, had to be strong for everyone else while I felt like I was drowning. Marcus had found the most effective way to hurt me. He couldn't physically get to me anymore because of the restraining order, so he decided to attack everything else that mattered to me: my reputation, my career, my relationships, my sense of safety in the world. I spent days trying to do damage control, reaching out to people individually to explain the truth, posting my own statement about being a domestic violence survivor, and clarifying that Marcus's allegations were false and part of his continued abuse. I shared the police report and restraining order to prove I wasn't lying, but I quickly learned that defending yourself against false accusations is like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. For every person who believed me, there were others who remained skeptical, who figured the truth was probably somewhere in the middle, who didn't want to get involved in what they saw as messy personal drama. The lies spread faster than the truth could catch up. Marcus's posts were shared and commented on. People who had never even met me were weighing in with their opinions, and I felt violated in a whole new way. My private trauma turned into public entertainment. My pain picked over by strangers who felt entitled to judge me. I had to make all my social media accounts private, had to block hundreds of people, had to essentially erase my online presence because Marcus had weaponized the internet against me. My lawyer sent him a cease and desist letter, warning that his harassment and defamation could result in legal action, but that only made him angrier, only made him more determined to destroy me. He started creating fake profiles to get around my blocks, leaving anonymous comments on my company's website and review pages, claiming I was unstable and dangerous, trying to get me fired. He sent packages to Jessica's apartment, things of mine he'd kept, but destroyed and defaced, photos of us with my face scratched out, clothes cut to pieces, small acts of violence that served as warnings of what he wanted to do to me. The fear of physical retaliation was constant and all-consuming. I couldn't go anywhere without looking over my shoulder, couldn't sleep without having nightmares about him breaking into Jessica's apartment. I bought pepper spray and kept it in my hand whenever I went outside. I took different routes to work every day. I parked in well-lit areas and checked my car before getting in it. Every time I saw someone who looked like him from behind, my heart would start racing. Every unknown phone number that called me sent me into a panic. Every shadow felt threatening. The restraining order was supposed to protect me, but it was just a piece of paper. It couldn't actually stop him if he decided to come after me. It could only punish him after the fact, and that knowledge left me feeling vulnerable and exposed all the time. My mental health was deteriorating rapidly under the constant stress. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time, jumped at every unexpected sound, cried at random moments throughout the day. Jessica suggested I start seeing a therapist, and I finally agreed, desperate for any kind of help processing what I was going through. My therapist diagnosed me with PTSD and helped me understand that my reactions were normal responses to abnormal circumstances, that I wasn't broken or weak, that I was surviving something traumatic and my body and mind were trying to protect me the only way they knew how. But the worst fear, the thing that kept me up at night more than anything else, was that Marcus would go after my family to hurt me. My parents lived 6 hours away in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and Marcus knew where they lived. He'd been to their house several times during our relationship, had met my younger siblings, knew their routines. I called my parents and begged them to be careful, to change their locks, to be aware of their surroundings, and I could hear the fear in my dad's voice when he promised they would take precautions. My younger sister Emma was a senior in high school, and I was terrified Marcus would target her, use her to get to me, so I made her promise not to walk anywhere alone, to tell her teachers and school administration that she might be in danger, to call me immediately if anything seemed off. The guilt of putting my family in danger was crushing. I blamed myself for bringing Marcus into their lives, for not seeing what he was sooner, for not protecting them from the consequences of my choices. I felt like I'd become a burden to everyone I loved. Jessica was dealing with the stress of having me in her home and the potential danger that came with it. My parents were worried sick and had to live with constant anxiety. My sister's senior year was being overshadowed by fear, all because of my failed relationship and my decision to finally leave. Marcus violated the restraining order twice in the first month. Once by showing up at my workplace, and once by sending me a series of threatening emails from a new account I hadn't blocked. Both times the police were called. Both times they couldn't do much beyond documenting the violations and warning him. And both times I felt the futility of trying to protect myself through legal means against someone who didn't care about consequences. The detective handling my case explained that unless Marcus actually physically harmed me, their hands were largely tied. Restraining order violations were hard to prosecute unless there was clear evidence of intent to harm, and his lawyers argued that his appearances near me were coincidental, that his emails were just trying to get closure, that he wasn't technically threatening me even though the subtext was crystal clear. I felt abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect me, felt like I was being told to wait until he actually hurt me before anyone would take real action, and that realization was terrifying. I started researching other options, learned about personal security measures, considered moving to a different state entirely, changed my name legally so he'd have a harder time tracking me, did everything I could think of to put distance and obstacles between us. The campaign of public destruction continued for months. Marcus was relentless in his efforts to ruin my reputation. He would go quiet for a week or two, and I'd start to hope it was over. Then suddenly there'd be a new wave of posts and messages and accusations. He contacted local news stations claiming to have a story about false domestic violence allegations and how men are victimized by the system, trying to use my case as his example, though fortunately none of them picked it up. He posted my personal information online, my phone number, my address, hoping that strangers would harass me on his behalf, and some of them did. I received threatening messages and creepy phone calls from people who'd bought into his narrative. He sent letters to my extended family members, cousins and aunts and uncles I barely knew, filling pages with lies about me, trying to turn everyone against me. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. This wasn't just anger or an inability to let go. This was systematic, planned destruction. He had decided that if he couldn't have control over me anymore, he would destroy my entire life so thoroughly that I'd have nothing left. I finally decided I had to protect my family more proactively. I couldn't just sit around waiting for Marcus to escalate to physical violence against them. I hired a private investigator to document Marcus's movements and behavior, to gather evidence of his harassment campaign that might be useful in strengthening my restraining order or pursuing criminal charges. I installed security cameras at my parents' house, paid for it myself despite their protests, because I needed to know they had some layer of protection. I worked with my sister's school to implement a safety plan where she could only be picked up by pre-authorized individuals and where staff were alerted to watch for anyone suspicious. I made sure my parents had panic buttons connected to local police and that all their doors and windows had reinforced locks and alarm systems. The expense of all these security measures was eating through my savings, but I didn't care. No amount of money was too much if it meant keeping my family safe from Marcus's revenge. I created a detailed safety plan for everyone, including code words we could use if we were in danger, but couldn't speak freely, regular check-in times so we'd know immediately if something was wrong, and evacuation plans for different scenarios. My life had become consumed by fear and hypervigilance. I was no longer living, just surviving, just waiting for the next attack. The person I'd been before Marcus, the confident professional woman who'd moved to a new city excited about her future, felt like a stranger from another lifetime. I was jumpy and paranoid, mistrustful of new people, unable to relax or feel safe anywhere. Simple activities that most people took for granted, like going to the grocery store or getting gas, required elaborate planning and constant awareness on my part. I stopped going out socially because I was afraid of running into Marcus or someone he'd sent to watch me. I declined job opportunities that would have advanced my career because they would have made me more visible and easier to find. I was letting him win, letting his campaign of terror control my choices and limit my life. And I hated it, hated him, hated myself for still being so affected by him months after I'd left. But knowing I should feel differently and actually feeling differently are two completely separate things. And despite all the therapy and all the logical understanding that his behavior wasn't my fault, I still felt like I was drowning. Still woke up every day exhausted from hypervigilance and nightmares. Still jumped at every unexpected sound. The turning point came about 5 months after I'd left, when Marcus made a crucial mistake that finally gave law enforcement something concrete to act on. He had gotten drunk and left me a voicemail a rambling 15-minute message where he explicitly threatened to hurt my family, naming my parents and my sister specifically, describing in disturbing detail what he wanted to do to them to punish me for leaving him. It was the first time he'd been so explicit and direct in a threat, and my lawyer immediately took the recording to the police and the district attorney's office. Finally, they took action. Marcus was arrested and charged with multiple counts of criminal threatening and stalking, and while he made bail within 24 hours, the arrest seemed to shake him, seemed to make him realize that he'd crossed a line that might have real consequences. The threats didn't stop entirely, but they decreased significantly in frequency and intensity, and I could breathe slightly easier knowing that now there was an actual criminal case building against him, that his harassment was being taken seriously by the legal system. The trial was scheduled for several months out, and in the meantime, the restraining order was extended and strengthened, with explicit provisions that he could have no contact with me or any of my family members directly or indirectly. I used that breathing room to start putting my life back together, to begin the process of healing and rebuilding that I'd been too overwhelmed to even attempt while under constant attack. I started going to therapy twice a week, working through the trauma and learning healthy coping mechanisms for the PTSD symptoms that still plagued me. I joined a support group for domestic violence survivors and found incredible comfort in being around other people who understood what I'd been through without needing explanation. I started exercising again, forcing myself to go to the gym even when I didn't feel like it, because physical activity helped burn off some of the constant anxiety that lived in my body. I slowly started reconnecting with old friends, being honest about what I'd been through and grateful when they responded with love and support rather than judgment. I worked on rebuilding my professional reputation, taking on high-visibility projects at work and doing excellent work that reminded people of my actual capabilities rather than Marcus's lies. I started writing, journaling about my experiences, processing my emotions on paper in a way that felt cathartic and healing. Most importantly, I started to forgive myself, to let go of the crushing guilt and shame I'd been carrying for staying with Marcus as long as I did, for not seeing the red flags sooner, for putting my family at risk. My therapist helped me understand that abuse victims aren't stupid or weak. We're normal people who got involved with someone skilled at manipulation, that the patterns of abuse are designed specifically to trap people and make them feel like they can't leave. She helped me see that leaving Marcus, despite all the terror and difficulty, was one of the bravest things I'd ever done, that surviving his campaign of revenge required strength I didn't even know I possessed. I started to recognize myself again when I looked in the mirror, started to see hints of the person I'd been before him, and more excitingly, glimpses of the person I was becoming, someone stronger and wiser and more resilient than I'd ever been before. The healing wasn't linear. I had good days and terrible days, days where I felt like I was making progress and days where I felt like I'd never be okay again. But gradually, incrementally, the good days started to outnumber the bad ones. The nightmares became less frequent. The hypervigilance started to ease just slightly. Marcus eventually pleaded guilty to reduce charges as part of a plea deal. He was sentenced to probation with mandatory anger management and a permanent restraining order that would follow him for years. It wasn't the justice I'd hoped for. I wanted him to serve actual prison time for what he'd put me through. But my lawyer explained that domestic violence cases are notoriously hard to prosecute, and that this outcome was actually better than what many victims get. The permanent restraining order meant he couldn't legally come near me or contact me for the foreseeable future, and the felony conviction on his record meant there would be consequences if he violated it. I had to find peace with that, had to accept that the justice system has limits and that sometimes you don't get the resolution you deserve. The trial being over brought a sense of closure, knowing that this chapter was finally, truly finished, that I could start moving forward without constantly looking backward. I made the decision to move back to my hometown, closer to my family, realizing that the isolation of living far away had made me more vulnerable to Marcus's control, and that I needed the support system I'd grown up with. It felt like admitting defeat in some ways, like I was letting Marcus drive me out of the city and the career I'd built there. But my therapist helped me reframe it as a positive choice I was making for my own well-being, rather than something I was being forced into. Now, 2 years after I left Marcus, I'm in a place I never thought I'd reach when I was in the depths of that nightmare. I'm not going to lie and say everything is perfect or that I'm completely healed, because trauma doesn't work that way. I still have moments of fear and anxiety, still struggle sometimes with trusting people or believing that I deserve good things. But I'm working, I'm thriving professionally in a new job that values me. I have strong relationships with my family and friends. I've even started dating again, though I'm taking it incredibly slow and being much more careful about red flags. I volunteer with a local domestic violence organization, sharing my story with other survivors and helping them navigate the process of leaving abusive relationships and rebuilding their lives. There's something incredibly healing about taking the worst experience of my life and using it to help others, about transforming my pain into purpose. My family is safe, Marcus has stayed away and appears to have moved on with his life. And while I'm always slightly vigilant, always aware that he's out there somewhere, I no longer live in constant fear of him. I've reclaimed my life, I've reclaimed myself, and that victory is sweeter than anything I've ever experienced. If you're watching this and you see yourself in my story, if you're in a relationship where you feel controlled or afraid or like you're walking on eggshells all the time, please know that what you're experiencing isn't love, it's abuse, and you deserve so much better. If you're planning to leave an abusive relationship, please be careful, please make a safety plan, please reach out to professionals who can help you do it as safely as possible because leaving is the most dangerous time, and you need support and resources. If you've already left and you're dealing with the aftermath, with the trauma and fear and difficulty of rebuilding, please know that it gets better, slowly and sometimes painfully, but it does get better, and you are so much stronger than you think you are. The fact that you survived makes you a warrior. The fact that you got out makes you brave beyond measure. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. Understanding this content, understanding the realities of domestic violence and how abusers operate, could literally save your life, or the life of someone you love, so please take it seriously. Please share this video with anyone who might need to hear it. If this story touched your heart, if it resonated with you or helped you in any way, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people find it and potentially helps more people escape dangerous situations. Comment below and tell me your thoughts. Tell me your own experiences if you feel comfortable sharing, because community and connection are so important in healing from trauma. Knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. Please subscribe to I Lived to Tell for more stories of survival and resilience, stories of people who went through hell and came out the other side, because these stories matter. They inspire hope. They show that survival is possible even when it seems impossible. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that you are worthy of love and respect and safety, always, no matter what anyone has told you otherwise. If you need help, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline or local resources in your area. Help is available and you don't have to go through this alone. Stay safe, stay strong, and know that there is life and joy and peace waiting for you on the other side of leaving.